So let's take a minute to go over what I just went over with finding the grams in a mole of sodium chloride in table salt. How do you find the grams in a mole of a substance, in 1 mole of a substance? Well, let's look at our first example, the one we just did, sodium chloride. And let's do this again and pay attention to how we do this. We have sodium chloride, which is 1 mole of sodium plus 1 mole of chlorine. So 1 mole of sodium plus 1 mole of chlorine equals 1 mole of sodium chloride. And if we go to the periodic table and we look at the sodium's atomic mass unit, that's 22.99. So 22.99 grams of sodium plus, let's go back to the periodic table. Here's chlorine over here. Chlorine's atomic mass unit is 35.45. So if we just turn that into grams, 35.45 grams of chlorine, and we add those together, the 22.99 grams of sodium plus the 35.45 grams of chlorine is going to equal 58.49 grams. So 58.49 grams of sodium chloride is going to equal 1 mole of sodium chloride. Now let's look at our second problem. Hydrochloric acid. So hydrochloric acid has 1 mole of hydrogen plus 1 mole of chlorine. So if we go to our periodic table, hydrogen is up here to the left, and hydrogen's atomic mass unit is 1.01. So 1.01 grams of hydrogen plus 1 mole of chlorine, which we already know from our sodium chloride. 1 mole of chlorine is 35.45 grams of chlorine. If you add those together, you get 36.46 grams of hydrochloric acid. And 36.46 grams of hydrochloric acid equals 1 mole of hydrochloric acid. Now let's look at our next one. Sulfuric acid. Now this sulfuric acid, because it has H2, the 2 is after the H, that means we're going to need 2 moles of hydrogen plus, and then we have a sulfur, plus 1 mole of sulfur plus oxygen. But look, after the oxygen we have a little number 4 there. So that means we're going to need 4 moles of oxygen. So let's start with the 2 moles of hydrogen. We already know that hydrogen is 1.01 grams per mole of hydrogen. But we need 2 moles of hydrogen. So that's going to be 2 times 1.01 grams of hydrogen, which gives us 2.02 grams of hydrogen is equal to 1 mole of hydrogen gas, or of H2. Then we have 1 mole of sulfur. Well, let's go to the periodic table, and sulfur is over here to the right next to chlorine, and sulfur's atomic mass unit is 32.07. So 32.07 grams of sulfur equals 1 mole of sulfur. Now we need to do the 4 moles of oxygen. So let's go to the periodic table again, and oxygen is up here on top of sulfur. And oops, I wrote over the oxygen. Now you can see oxygen's atomic mass unit is 16.00. So 16.00 grams of oxygen, that equals 1 mole of oxygen. But we don't need 1 mole of oxygen, we need 4 moles of oxygen. So we need to take that times 4. So 16 times 4 is 64.00. So 64 grams of oxygen equals 1 mole of O4, of 4 moles of oxygen. 1 mole of O4. So now we have, if sulfuric acid is 2 moles of hydrogen, 1 mole of sulfur, and 4 moles of oxygen, and 2 moles of hydrogen is 2.02 grams, 1 mole of sulfur is 32.07 grams, and 4 moles of oxygen is 64.00 grams. We just add those up together. So 2.02 plus 32.07 plus 64.00 is going to give us 98.09 grams of sulfuric acid, and that equals 1 mole of sulfuric acid. Now let's look at our next one, calcium fluoride. So calcium fluoride is made up of 1 mole of calcium and 2 moles of fluorine. So 1 mole of calcium plus 2 moles of fluorine. Now let's find out how many grams is in 1 mole of calcium. Let's look at the periodic table. And calcium's on your left in the second row, or the second column. And calcium's atomic mass number is 40.08. So 40.08 grams of calcium plus 2 moles of fluorine. So how many grams is in 1 mole of fluorine? Let's look at here is, let me get rid of the oxygen so you can read it. Here is fluorine, and fluorine has an atomic mass number of 19.00, but we need 2 moles of fluorine. So 19.00 grams of fluorine equals 1 mole of fluorine. So 2 moles of fluorine means you're going to take that 19 grams times 2, and that'll give us 38 grams of fluorine is in 1 mole of F2. So let's go back. So 38 grams of F2 is 1 mole of F2. So now we just add these together. Calcium and 2 moles of fluorine. So 40.08 plus 38 is going to give us 78.08 grams of calcium fluoride. So the 78.08 grams of calcium fluoride equals 1 mole of calcium fluoride. Now let's do our final problem down here, potassium sulfide. So potassium sulfide has 2 moles of K in it, of potassium, and 1 mole of sulfur. So let's go to the periodic table and find and calculate how many grams is in 2 moles of potassium, of K. So if I erase calcium over here, here's potassium right here, and its atomic mass number is 39.10. So 39.10 grams equals 1 mole of K, of potassium. But we need 2 moles of potassium, so we have to take 39.1 times 2, and that's going to give us 78.20 grams is going to equal 2 moles of potassium. So 78.20 grams of K2 plus how many grams is in a mole of sulfur. So let's go back to the periodic table, and sulfur is underneath oxygen, and its atomic mass unit is 32.07. So let's go back and write that in, 32.07 grams of sulfur, and you just add them together. 78.20 plus 32.07 is going to give us 110.27 grams of potassium sulfide. So 110.27 grams is going to equal 1 mole of potassium sulfide. So now that we've found out how many grams of each substance is in 1 mole of that substance, for instance, sodium chloride, we have 58.49 grams in 1 mole. Hydrochloric acid is 36.46 grams per mole per 1 mole of hydrochloric acid. Sulfuric acid has 98.09 grams in 1 mole of sulfuric acid. Calcium fluoride has 78.08 grams per mole, and potassium sulfide has 110.27 grams per mole. So if we want to find out how many grams is in a part of or more than 1 mole, all we need to do is multiply the number of grams in the mole by how many moles there are. So at the top, if we have, for sodium chloride, if we have 58.49 grams is in 1 mole of sodium chloride, which we already figured out, but we don't have a whole mole of sodium chloride. We only have 0.75 moles of sodium chloride. That's 3/4 of a mole. We would take that 58.49 and we would multiply it by 0.75, which gives us 43.8675, and that is how many grams of sodium chloride we have in 0.75 moles. Same with hydrochloric acid. If we have 36.46 grams per mole, but we have 1.33 moles. We just multiply that and we're going to get 48.4918 grams of hydrochloric acid. Sulfuric acid, same thing. We have 98.09 grams per mole, and we have 0.10 moles. So if we multiply that together, 98.09 times 0.10 is 9.809 grams of sulfuric acid. Calcium fluoride is 78.08 grams per mole, but we have 2.86 moles. So if you multiply those together, you get 223.3088 grams. So if we have 2.86 moles of calcium fluoride, we're going to have 223.3088 grams of calcium fluoride. And one more, potassium sulfide is 110.27 grams per mole. But we don't have a whole mole. We only have a fourth of a mole. We have 0.25 moles. So 110.27 times 0.25 gives us 27.5675 grams of potassium sulfide. If we only have 0.25 moles of potassium sulfide, that's going to be 27.5675 grams of potassium sulfide.